Today we're going to cover Chapter 2, Section 1, which is centered on the city-states of Mesopotamia. This is the first section of Chapter 2. When you think about Chapter 2, it's about the early river valley civilization. So we'll talk about Mesopotamia, otherwise known as Sumerians. We'll talk about Egypt. We'll talk about China, and we'll talk about the Indus River Valley. Those are really the first four culture hearths where people started to originate and develop civilization. Note that they are all along major rivers, and those rivers gave a lot of advantages to these early settlements. We'll talk about some of those advantages as we go throughout today's lesson and then the subsequent lessons throughout the chapter. We'll start off with a little bit of geography. We're going to talk about the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent is actually a region. It's a region in Southwest Asia, which is today a lot of people tend to refer to it as the Middle East. Basically, we're talking about modern day Iraq. That's kind of the general location that we're talking about when we mention the Fertile Crescent. It has a curved shape, so that's why it's called the crescent, like a moon shape. And it does have very rich land, or great land for growing crops. That's why it's called the Fertile Crescent. Now, within the Fertile Crescent is a smaller region called Mesopotamia. Now, Mesopotamia literally translates as the land between two rivers. That's a Greek word that really talks about this region. It is a portion of the Fertile Crescent. Now, I'm going to also talk about the two major rivers that run along the outside frame of Mesopotamia. Now, so we said that Mesopotamia is the land between two rivers. Those two rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates. I'm going to show you a quick map here that is from your textbook, and this talks about this region that we're taking a look at here. This is the Fertile Crescent, this green shaded region. This is the Euphrates River on the southern border of the Fertile Crescent and Mesopotamia, and this is the Tigris River, which is on the northern border of Mesopotamia. Now, this area is extremely fertile because what you have is these rivers flood, and we'll talk about why that's an advantage, not a disadvantage in this case. Now, down here in purple, you see the region of Sumer. Now, this is where some of the earliest civilized major city-states began to develop. The city-states of Lagash, Uruk, Umma, Kish. We sort of alluded to these a little bit in Chapter 1, Section 3, but we're going to be taking a grand look at that today. Once again, this is kind of what it looks like in the present day. Here's the Persian Gulf, here's Kuwait, here's Iran, here's Iraq. So when you talk Mesopotamia, you're really talking Iraq, modern day. Okay. All right, so let's talk about rivers and why they're so important. I'm not going to go through all the bullet points, but here's basically what happens. At least one time per year, the Tigris and Euphrates would flood. Now, generally, when we think about a flood, we think, oh, that's, that could be catastrophic, that could be problematic. But in the case of Mesopotamia, what happens is the flood expands the border of the rivers. And then that flood water will sit on top of soil for a month, 2 months, sometimes longer. And then what will eventually happen is that flood will recede, and it's going to leave behind a very fertile type of soil called silt. Now, this silt was extremely rich in soil. It was very much irrigated because of all the water that was sitting on it. So it produced a great quantity of wheat and barley, which were two of the big crops grown in this part of the world at the time. What happens is because you can grow an excess amount of food based on these flood patterns, it allows your villages to then grow, and then your population can expand. And then once you have a higher population, you can get specialized workers, as we talked about. And then when you have specialized workers, you have advanced technology. So the flooding in the case of Mesopotamia was actually a positive. Now, there are some disadvantages to it that we'll talk about, but all in all, it's a positive theme. Okay, let's take a look at this region of the world, Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq. What are some of the environmental challenges? Okay, First of all, we want to talk about, hey, when was this going on historically? Well, the first settlements of Mesopotamia occurred prior to 4500 BC. If you ask a lot of historians, one of the arguments would be that Mesopotamia, Sumer, really your earliest civilized region. You've got China, you've got the Indus Valley, you've got Egypt, all kind of happening around the same time. But with evidence, Mesopotamia, one of your oldest. Around 3300 BC, the people that we call the Sumerians moved into this region because of their discovery of this very fertile soil due to the floods. Now let's talk about some of the disadvantages here. There were floods, but the problem was the flooding was unpredictable. You just didn't know how much it was going to flood, and you didn't know exactly when. So it made it really difficult to plan out when we were going to grow our crops, when we were going to plant them, when we were going to harvest them. The second disadvantage is that it says no natural barriers for defense. I'm going to say limited natural barriers of defense. Rivers are not really a natural barrier of defense. Natural barriers of defense would be like mountains. There are the Zagros Mountains to the north. A desert would be a natural barrier of defense. Things that are very difficult for armies to cross, which would kind of prevent a conquest. Now, in the region of Mesopotamia, they're framed by rivers. The Zagros Mountains are to the distant north, and then the desert is to the distant south. Other than that, in the immediate region, there's limited natural barriers of defense. So you're kind of open to invasion. The third key disadvantage here of this region of Mesopotamia is that there were limited natural resources. And when we say limited natural resources, we're talking about building materials and other natural goods, timber, stone. Usually this is the case when you don't have natural barriers of defense. You generally are also lacking in natural resources. So the Sumerian people had some disadvantages that they had to kind of deal with and overcome. And we'll take a look at how they solved some of these problems. Capital letter E says, solving problems with organization. One of the characteristics of civilization that we learned about in chapter 1 is complex institutions. Complex institution, basically a government style, a rule and order, okay, economic planning. So the Sumerians had that, and we'll talk about that. Here are the Sumerian solutions. So if you look at disadvantages A, B, and C, you'll see Sumerian solutions A, B, and C kind of answering how they how they responded to some of those disadvantages. So to solve the problem of unpredictable flooding, what they did is they created irrigation ditches, or you could also call these irrigation canals, which would provide water to their fields. So this way they had water going to their crops year round. Now, an irrigation canal is basically, you think about the major river, and then you're going to have branches off of that river into the crop fields. Also, because they had limited natural barriers of defense, the Sumerians used sun-dried mud bricks to create city walls. Most of the Sumerian cities were surrounded by a 10 to 20 foot defense wall, which was made out of sun-dried mud bricks. So what they would do is they would make a wooden box. They would take some of that silty, muddy soil. They would fill it. They would fill the box with that soil. Then they would let the sun beat on it for a day, 2 days, maybe a week. And then what they would simply do is turn it over. And these were fairly large boxes. I would say probably about the size of a modern day Ford Focus, smaller Ford sport car or something like that. When they turn them over, they're going to be fairly large, and they're going to be not too heavy because they're made of mud instead of stone. So they're going to be able to be hoisted and moved around. But these mud bricks were excellent for defense. Now, to solve the problem of limited natural resources, the Sumerian people traded. And some of the things that they traded were the things that they had that others didn't. One of the things they had a great deal of was excess grain. And so they would trade that grain and cloth and some of the tools that they would make through metallurgy, which is basically blacksmithing or creating tools and weapons out of metals like copper, tin, eventually bronze. And they would trade those things for stone, wood, and metal that they didn't have from other peoples. And we also learned that advanced cities are those that trade with outlying cities and regions. So this definitely qualifies the Sumerians as a true civilization. Now, next we'll talk about some leadership. Obviously, to do all of these things, to create all these Sumerian solutions, you need great leadership and you need government. So laws and leadership became really important because the Sumerian solutions required a lot of cooperation to get things done. Now, also, I want to make a point that rules and laws were actually needed to settle issues over land and water and how those things would be distributed. Once you have a population developing, people are going to start to have conflict. They're going to start to fight over, hey, is this my plot of land? Is this my water? Who's controlling this? So there's going to be conflicts that need to be solved through law and order, or rules and laws and government bodies. Next, we'll take a look at the second major portion of this section, Roman numeral 2. Sumerians create what are called city-states, okay? A city-state, this is a really important definition to have because we're going to talk about this when we get to Greece, and then we're going to talk about this when we get to other regions in the world. But a city-state is simply a city, but also its surrounding land that functions as an independent political unit. Some examples from Sumer would be Uruk, Kish, Lagash, Umma, and Ur. Those are all the major city-states that I showed you on the map that we had here a few moments ago. Now, I want to talk about city-states. When we think about Sumer, or when we say Sumerians, they probably would not have called themselves Sumerians. This is what historians refer to them as because of the region being named Sumer. But in general, because they're from city-states, they saw themselves as independent of one another or each other. And so they probably would have called them Urukians or Kishites or Lagashians, something along those lines, because they were Sumerians. They had a lot of similar cultural traits, but they went to war with these other city-states, and they also traded. So they didn't see themselves as like one unified political unit. I would like to think about this. Let's say that we have the state of Michigan. Let's say that the city of Detroit was its own political entity. It wasn't tied to Michigan. It wasn't tied to the United States of America. It was its own independent political unit. It operated on its own. Priests and rulers. We'll talk a little bit about some of the key ruling bodies and governing officials. The earliest governments in Sumer and really worldwide were controlled by what we know as temple priests. These priests would manage everything. Pretty much they would manage the irrigation system. They would demand a portion of every farmer's crop as a form of taxes. You paid your taxes by giving a certain amount or weight of grain. That's basically how you paid your taxes back then. Today, it's a portion taken out of your paycheck. After 3000 BC, now, when war and fighting and conquest and turbulent times became more frequent, the military leaders became the full-time rulers. Your military generals stepped in and took charge during those times. And what would eventually happen is those military rulers wanted to stay in power, and they started the idea of passing down their rule or their throne, you could say, to their eldest son or their next closest family member. This is where we get the term dynasty. A dynasty is simply a series of rulers from a single family. So if you think about someone in our class, let's just say it's Johnny X, and you're going to have Johnny X the first. Now, when he passes away, he's going to pass down his throne and the rule of this city-state to his oldest son. That would be Johnny X the second. Then he's going to do the same thing, Johnny X the third, so on and so forth. That's an example of a dynasty, a series of rulers from the same family. If it didn't get passed down to the oldest son, sometimes it could, if he didn't have a son, it could go to the ruler's brother or closest male relative. Next is point 5. After 2500 BC, many Sumerian city-states actually came under the rule of dynasty. So this is the time period, 2500 BC, when we see a little bit more military conquest and conflict. Next is capital C. We'll talk about how once we have these cities developed in Sumer and then other parts of the world, how do they then spread? Well, with Sumer, they had the excess surplus of food, which is great because this allowed them to increase their long-distance trade. What they did is they exchanged or traded their extra food for goods that they didn't have or needed. Then one of the things you have to understand is when you trade goods, you are interacting with other peoples. And when you're interacting with other peoples, you're going to learn things that you didn't know before. They're going to have some items that you don't have. You're going to have some items that they don't have. And this is a time period in which trade became really important. And there's something that's called cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion is a process in which a new idea or product is spread from one culture to another. Here's kind of a scenario here that would give you an example of this. Let's say you're a Sumerian trader and you're sent off to Egypt. And when you go to Egypt, you're traveling in a horse and buggy. Now, the Sumerians did not use the wheel. So this is just an example. They had a wheel, but it was a long time until they put it on a buggy, okay? They were the first to invent the wheel, though, by the way. Most of the way that they used it was for moving around their large mud bricks, draining up water or gathering up water from wells, so on and so forth. Eventually, they put it on a wagon. But let's say that a Sumerian travels to Egypt in a wagon carried by a horse. When he gets there, the Egyptians are going to say, "Whoa, what is this? What is this big box that moves and carried by a horse?" And then they're going to want that item. They're going to ask the trader, "Hey, how do you make this? Can we pay you to teach us how to do this? Or can we buy this one from you?" This is an example of cultural diffusion. Another way that this really spreads is in war. If one side of a battle has iron weapons and the other side has wooden weapons, well, it's pretty clear who's going to probably win. And what's going to happen is the people who have the wooden weapons are going to go back after the battle if they survive, and they're going to say, "Hey, we need to get whatever those metal weapons are. We need to figure out how to make that so that we can be a formidable opponent here." Okay, that's another example of cultural diffusion. It's ideas, concepts, items, tools, weapons that are spreading from one culture to another. Since we're talking about the spread of culture, let's talk about some Sumerian culture in specific here. First of all, religion. Well, the Sumerians were polytheistic. They believed in, what that means is they believed in more than one god. They actually believed in many gods. And they believed that their gods were immortal and all powerful. So did the Greeks, so did the Romans. So this is polytheism back in the ancient world is very popular. Now, to keep their gods happy, what the Sumerians would do is they would build these giant temples called ziggurats, okay? And they would sacrifice animals, food, and wine. We don't have much evidence of them sacrificing humans. Other civilizations in the ancient world did that. The Sumerians, we don't have much evidence of that. One of the things that we will come to know about Sumerians is that it is written in an ancient epic called the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is a story about a Sumerian soldier. It's written that they did believe in the afterlife, but they didn't think it was a very joyous one. In fact, if you do your research on this, it says they kind of returned to the mud and the dirt. So it really wasn't a joyous afterlife at all, according to the Sumerians. Capital letter B, we'll talk about how Sumerian society is structured. Well, the social classes would be as follows. The upper class, you'd have people like the king, his family, wealthy landowners. Sometimes those are referred to as nobles. You'd have your high priest or your religious leaders, and you'd have your wealthy merchants. Merchants are people who buy and sell things. They're like your top traders. Okay. The middle class would be made up of farm workers and workshop keepers. So people that are working as blacksmiths, people that are working as textile producers. That's clothing makers. Okay. The lower class in Sumer would be slaves. They did have slavery. This is one of the earliest civilizations in the history of the world, and they had slavery, a terrible institution. They utilized, the way that they did slavery is that slaves were foreigners who had been captured in battles. So when they'd have a war against a foreign entity and they captured someone, they would make them a slave. Slavery was a lot different in Sumer than what you might think of in later systems like the American system. You could actually earn your freedom in the Sumerian system due to good works. This rarely happened in the American system. Next is capital letter C. We'll talk about Sumerian women. One of the things about history, guys, is you have to understand a lot of it is focused on the patriarchal society because a lot of the leaders were males. Well, in Sumerian society, the earliest society, women had an equal footing with men. And I think that's really impressive. It's really important to understand that women start off in the earliest societies with gender equality. Almost. I mean, it's very close. But over the course of time and as history progresses, we'll see that that sort of dips a little bit, which is unfortunate. And today we're starting to see a rise in the call for gender equality. Now, women could work. They could hold jobs. In later societies, they were not allowed to do this. They could work as merchants or farmers or artisans. They could actually own property in their own name. This is a really big sign. This means that women could have power. They had ownership. They could control males. They could also join the priesthood. This is unheard of. I mean, even in the Catholic faith, we don't have women who are, ordained priests. We do have nuns, but these women are leading the temple rituals and so on and so forth. Some upper class women learned to read and write in the Sumerian language, which was called cuneiform, which we learned about in a previous section. But what I would say overall, guys, is really important point. If you were doing this in class, I'd say put a star by this. Sumerian women had more rights than many women in later civilizations. I think that's a striking point, and that's a really good thing, by the way, that we're trying to get back to in today's society. Next is capital letter D. Talk a little bit about Sumerian science and technology. They're very impressive, guys. The earliest civilization, they had so many inventions. Let's talk about some of them quickly here. Most historians will credit Sumerians with inventing the wheel, the plow, and the sail. They're also the first to use bronze. If you remember, bronze is a mixture of copper and tin. So basically what you do is you melt down a certain ratio of copper and tin together. When it hardens, okay, it creates a much stronger, more durable substance called bronze. And that brings us into the Bronze Age, roughly 3000 BC. Arithmetic and geometry. They used mathematics to build city walls and buildings. They also planned their irrigation canal systems with this. And then they also created surveys of fields, like basically the pitch of a field. Is water going to drain? Is water going to puddle and flood in this area? So that's what surveying fields. If you're ever driving and you see these guys with like these tripods and orange vests and they're looking through looks like a telescope, they're basically surveying fields to look at the scope and the layout and the undulations of the land. Another interesting factor is that the Sumerians developed the numbering system with the base of 60. This system is what we use as the modern units in measuring time today. So their base was 60, okay? Architecture, arches, columns, ramps, pyramid structure. These are all shapes that were used to design those large religious temples that are called the ziggurat, okay? We learned about those in chapter 1. Of course, another major invention is writing in the form of cuneiform. Cuneiform is the Sumerian system of writing. It's the oldest known system of writing in our world. And they would record things like maps. They'd also record the location of the stars and other planets, chemistry that they thought was important, different chemical equations, for example, how to make bronze, and then also medicine. They were some of the first people to work with medicinal value of natural resources. Now, Roman numeral 4 is going to talk about this region as creating the first empire. We'll talk about what an empire is here momentarily, but what ends up happening in Sumeria is because it's a very popular place, because they're doing very well, they're civilized, they have farming, they have a surplus of food. A lot of people want to come to this region, and a lot of people want to take it over. So from 3000 to 2000 BC now, this is BC era, the city-states of Sumer were constantly at war with each other. So you have a civil war. They're constantly fighting against each other for resources, for land, for water. These wars eventually weakened them to the point that they could no longer fight off attacks from outsiders. Okay, so they're fighting within each other. They're having a civil war. There's infighting, you could say, in Sumer. Even though they didn't see themselves as Sumerians, they still historically were infighting. And what ends up happening is as the new conquerors come in, they eventually win because the Sumerian city-states had been depleted from fighting each other. The good thing about this for the Sumerians is that their civilization lived on. Most of the people who were attacking were nomadic peoples, sometimes still hunter-gatherer tribes that had become large and kind of created alliances. Their civilization, their culture was not as advanced, so they simply adopted the Sumerian language, the Sumerian writing, the Sumerian religion, the Sumerian economic practices, so on and so forth. One of the first key figures that we're going to learn about this year, one of the first key figures or key people is Sargon of Akkad. Now, let me tell you the story about Sargon. Sargon, around 2350 BC, we don't know exactly. These are really rough estimates on the dates back this long ago. Sargon was a conqueror. He's a military guy. He actually defeated the city-states of Sumer. He brought in his army from the city-state of Akkad, which was just a little bit northwest, I would say, of Sumer. And basically what he's doing, he's kind of sitting up in a little bit elevated area, and he's watching. And he's got spies. All these guys had spies, and they're watching, and they're saying, yeah, say, them Sumerians are fighting against each other, say. And, he's watching, and all of a sudden he says, bam, this is my time to attack. They're weak. This is a great time. He uses his expertise to a T, and he comes in and takes over both the northern and southern regions of Sumer. Now, eventually, once he takes over these city-states, he then spreads a little bit further throughout all of Mesopotamia, and he creates what's called the world's first empire. An empire is where a single ruler brings several peoples, nations, you could call them countries, or previously independent states under his control or under her control, basically bringing under the control of one single ruler. So you take the Sargon of Akkad, he conquers Uruk, Lagash, Kish. He conquers city-states like near Babylon, and that becomes an empire because he's controlling all of those formerly independent regions. Now, this was called the Acadian Empire because he's Sargon of Akkad, and the Acadians would control this region from the Mediterranean coast all the way east into Iran for about 200 years. But it eventually also declined due to infighting, outside invasion, and then famine due to a drought around that time period. So first we had the Sumerians, then we had the Acadians coming in, but once again, they adopted Sumerian culture, so they still were kind of known as Sumerians. Then the next key empire in this region is called the Babylonian Empire. Okay, the Babylonian Empire came into play around 2000 BC. They were basically warriors that were called the Amorites, and they invaded Mesopotamia, defeating the Acadians, which were at that time called the Sumerians. So the Amorites eventually overthrew the Sumerians / Acadians and established their capital city at Babylon. Babylon's a very famous city. I'm sure you've heard of it. It's in the Bible. It's also in many history books, but it's along the Euphrates River. Now, one key figure that ruled Babylon, or the Babylonian Empire, was Hammurabi. King Hammurabi was the Babylonian ruler from 1792 to 1750. That's a pretty long time to rule. I don't know if you guys study history, but that's a very long time to be in power as an emperor / king. He's most well known, guys, for his code of laws called Hammurabi's Code, which kind of emphasized an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Basically, it's written that if you blacken someone's eye, they can blacken yours back. If you knock out somebody's tooth, they're allowed to knock yours back. But then there's some pretty harsh punishments. Like if you're caught stealing, it doesn't matter what it is. If you're caught stealing in a merchant's trader stall, you'll have your hand cut off. Okay? If you steal from the government, you'll be sentenced to death. So there's a lot of very specific laws, 282 in fact. Most of them talk about family relations, business conduct, and crime, but there were actually different punishments for the rich and the poor. They also had different punishments for men and women. So it wasn't a very, it didn't provide great justice in an equal way. Okay. So that's one of the things that you want to think about when you're talking about Hammurabi's code. Now, after Hammurabi, the Babylonian Empire became a little bit smaller. They started to get invaded by other people. Remember, this is a very, very popular spot. And eventually a group called the Kassites took over. So if you're following along with me, you've got first the Sumerians, then the Acadians, then the Babylonians, which were also known as the Amorites, and then the Kassites. So this is sort of the historic control of this region of Mesopotamia / Sumer, which is characterized by the Fertile Crescent. Next section, we'll be covering Chapter 2, Section 2, which is on Egypt. It's going to be another long one like this one was, because, hey, these are some of the earliest and greatest known civilizations in the history of the world.